Let me begin by giving you an idea of how this talk comes about. Until earlier this year, I was the poison garden warden at the Annick Garden. And one of the questions which visitors to the poison garden would often ask was, have you got something undetectable? I want to be able to get away with murder. Now, I always assumed that they were being facetious. Can't be sure, of course. But I always gave them a serious answer. And that serious answer is that the way to get away with murder is to not have anyone believe that murder took place. If no one suspects murder, then there's no chance of you being found out. So that started the idea of giving a talk about how people have used some of these poisonous plants as murder weapons. And when I realised that that talk would probably take 4 or 5 hours, I thought I'd concentrate on the last couple of 100 years and concentrate on medical professionals, doctors and nurses, who are in the best position to obtain these substances and use them as murder weapons. So this is why the talk is about the medical murderers of the poison garden. When we're talking about medical marvels, we've got to talk about the paper somniferum, the opium poppy. It produces morphine, one of the most useful painkillers that we know. Not without its problems, because it is addictive. But it's been very, very helpful for millions of people for thousands of years. Morphine is extracted from opium, which is the juice that flows from the seed head of the poppy. And opium has been known certainly since 1500 BC. It was used in ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, it was given to babies to help them go to sleep. The recipe for using it that way requires that it be mixed up with fly excrement. Now, that tells me 2 things. First of all, I suspect the use may have been more psychological than physical. Because frankly, I think the second time my mother said to me, if you don't go to sleep, I'm going to give you some opium and fly dust, I'd go to sleep. But the other thing that struck me is, there must have been an awful lot of flies in Egypt if it was practicable to collect their excrement. But that's how long we've known about using opium as a painkiller. Morphine was first extracted from opium in about 1817. Bizarrely, they wanted to get the morphine because they thought it could be used to treat opium addiction. They didn't realise that it was the morphine that was causing the addiction in the first place. Later in the 19th century, they extracted cocaine from coca leaves because they thought that would treat morphine addiction. We've managed to do some pretty silly things in our time with these plants. It was about the 1850s, before the invention of the hypodermic syringe. So up until then, if you were having morphine, you had to swallow it. In 1823, another French doctor, Dr. Edmy Castain, persuaded a gentleman called Hippolyte Ballet to swallow a fatal dose of morphine. He was being paid by Monsieur Ballet's brother, because Monsieur Ballet's brother wanted to inherit the whole family wealth. Didn't do him a lot of good, because a couple of years later, Dr. Castain murdered him when there was a dispute about ongoing payments. But Dr. Edmy Castain is the first murderer using morphine. 1892, funnily enough, the same year as Dr. Thomas Cream, 1892, but in New York, Dr. Robert Buchanan murdered his second wife. He divorced his first wife and married Anna Sutherland. Dr. Buchanan was a prominent doctor in New York. Anna Sutherland was a brothel keeper. And people thought, this is a strange marriage. They weren't married for very long, and Anna Sutherland died, and her death was attributed to natural causes. But then 2 things happened. First of all, Dr. Buchanan remarried his first wife, and people started to get suspicious. But then he was heard talking about another case where a medical student had murdered his girlfriend with morphine. And Dr. Buchanan was heard saying he was stupid. One thing morphine does, it makes the pupils pinpoint. Remember I said atropine makes the pupils dilate. So Dr. Buchanan was saying, you know, it was silly. If you're going to murder someone with morphine, you should put atropine in their eyes at the same time and cancel out the effects so no one could see the pinpointing. There's another story coming up that's going to make you go, eh, again, I'm afraid. In court, Dr. Buchanan used that as his main defence. It couldn't have been, I couldn't have murdered a woman with morphine, it couldn't have been morphine. Where's the pinpoint? And in those days, the forensic science wasn't so good that they could be sure. They could detect morphine in the body, but they couldn't say precisely what effect it would have had. So Dr. Buchanan said, well, it couldn't have been morphine, there was no pinpointing. So to counteract that claim, the prosecution brought a live cat into court, gave it an injection of morphine, and put atropine in its eyes as it died, and then passed it round the jury so the jury could see that its pupils were normal. And that convicted Dr. Buchanan. 1949, Dr. Robert Clements. Dr. Robert Clements is thought murdered all 4 of his wives. It's only known for sure that he murdered the 4th, but it's assumed he murdered the other 3 as well. Certainly when his 3rd wife died, after she'd been buried, there was some suspicion. The police became involved, but they didn't have enough evidence to justify an exhumation, so it was left to pass. His 4th wife died. And it happened that the policeman that had briefly investigated the 3rd wife got to hear him just before the funeral was due to take place. With the first 3 wives, Dr. Clements had signed the death certificate himself. In those days, it wasn't illegal, disallowed. It was possible for doctors to sign their own wives' husbands' death certificates. It was discouraged, but there were no rules against it. So Dr. Clements had signed the first 3 wives' death certificates. Whether because of the suspicion after the 3rd case, the 4th one, he had a Dr. James Houston sign the death certificate as leukemia. But then the policeman who'd been involved in the 3rd case heard about it and had enough evidence to order a post-mortem. The funeral was postponed and a post-mortem was ordered. As soon as Dr. Clements got word that the funeral had been postponed, he gave himself a fatal injection of morphine and committed suicide. An interesting aside, Dr. James Houston also committed suicide. The report suggests he was a very shy young man. He may have been put under pressure by Dr. Clements, and he was so ashamed of what he'd done that he couldn't continue to live. But it's possible that he was involved in a conspiracy. There's an interesting comparison between Robert Buchanan in 1892, who thought he could bluff his way out of it in court by arguing against the paltry forensic evidence, and Dr. Clements, who in 1949 knew that if they did a post-mortem with his wife, they would be able to demonstrate that he had murdered. That was certain. That's the way forensic science progressed over that time period. In 1980, in a book called Cause of Death, Frank Smythe, the author, quotes an unnamed American toxicologist talking about the Robert Buchanan case and saying, forensic science has moved on massively since that time. There's no need for this dead cats in court, none of these theatrics. The science is absolutely solid. You would have to be an expert to get away with murder using morphine. In 1980, when that book was published, Dr. Harold Shipman was 9 years into a 28-year career of committing murder using morphine. And he got away with it for all that time because nobody suspected that murder was taking place. Well, that brings us to the end of this fairly brief look at some of the medical murders of the last 200 years, except to say, I began by saying the way to get away with murder is to not have anyone believe that murder is taking place. So you have to ask yourself, is this really the end of the medical murders? Thank you.